Okay, so let's talk about the circulatory system and the cardiovascular system. So first of all, the term cardiovascular system applies to the heart and the vessels of the system together. So cardio always refers to the heart, and vascular refers to the vessels. So we have the veins, we have the arteries, and we have the capillaries. Okay, so those three vessels together make up the vascular part of the cardiovascular system. So if we take a look at the exterior of our heart up here, we can see some very distinguishing features, and we want to be able to always orient ourselves in terms of the right side versus the left side of the heart. So because not all pictures are always going to be the same in terms of the orientation of the heart. Okay, so we want to make sure we always know which side of the heart we're dealing with. So the best way to actually do that is to always look for the vena cava. The vena cava is the largest vein in the body, and you'll notice you'll have a superior vena cava, so superior meaning on top, and then you have an inferior vena cava, of course meaning inferior on the bottom, right? So the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava are always going to be on the right side of the heart. So that's what you're always going to look for, okay? So what these vessels are for is these are very, very large veins that carry deoxygenated blood from the top part of our body, the superior, so that would be our head, shoulders, etc., and from the bottom part of our body, so that would be like our legs and our hips, etc., and takes that deoxygenated blood back to the right side of the heart so it eventually can receive more oxygen. Okay, so that's kind of our distinguishing feature in terms of left versus right side of the heart. Now you'll also notice that this kind of little point here, this is called the apex, and you can see that the heart kind of almost points to the side, and so the apex always is kind of slanted towards the left side of the heart. Now, that's not foolproof in terms of identifying the right and the left side of the hearts. Vena cava in these types of diagrams is always the best way to identify. Now, the other thing you can see on the exterior is you can see these very fine arteries called coronary arteries. So again, that term coronary, just like cardiac, always applies to the heart. And coronary arteries are very specific arteries because they're found on the surface of the heart tissue only. And so these coronary arteries will supply oxygen and nutrients to the heart cell tissue so that the heart can keep beating. And in fact, when a person has a blockage in a coronary artery, that's what can lead to a heart attack or even a cardiac arrest, okay? Because the heart tissue is deprived of oxygen and nutrients it needs to keep operating. So if we look at the other parts on the exterior, you can see the aorta, and the aorta is the largest of the arteries, okay, in our bodies. And you can see that where the vena cava had blood coming back to the heart, notice that the aorta has these arrows going up from it because the aorta is the first vessel in the body, it's the first artery in the body to actually receive oxygenated blood, and then it pumps that blood out into the rest of the body, okay? So that's one important thing to remember about that aorta. Largest of the arteries, and oxygenated blood is going to leave the aorta and go to different parts of our body. Now let's shift over to the other side and take a look at our cross-section of our heart so we can take a look at some of these structures on the inside. So here's the superior vena cava again and the inferior vena cava again, so that we know then we have our right side of our heart. And then here of course is our aorta, so that's our very large artery that is going to take the oxygenated blood up and into the subsidiary vessels so that it can be transported to the rest of our body. Now if we look at our interior of our heart consists of 4 chambers. So the chambers at the top are smaller and thinner walled, and those are called the atria. And so remember what I said, vena cava is always on the right side of the heart. So we have the right atrium, and then on the other side, we have the left atrium. So atrium is plural, atria is singular. So notice they have thin walls, okay, and they're quite small. Now on the bottom, we have another couple of chambers, and these are called, I'm sure you've heard this before, the ventricles. And so of course on that right side we have the right ventricle, and then on the left side we have the left ventricle. And one thing I want you to notice about the ventricles is, number one, they're larger than the atria are, and number two, I want you to notice that they are much thicker in terms of the muscle tissue that they have surrounding them. And that's because really what the atria have to do is they have to contract strongly enough to push the blood into the ventricles. The ventricles, on the other hand, have to pump the blood out of the body. So the left ventricle is going to pump the blood into the aorta and out, and then the right ventricle is going to send blood to the lungs rather, to pick up more oxygen. So that's why you have a much thicker wall there, because much more force is necessary to move that blood. You can also notice that in the middle here, we have this thick band of tissue, and that's called a septum, S-E-P-T-U-M, a septum. And the septum in mammals is fully developed. That means it is all the way up the heart, from the tip all the way up to the top of the atria. And what the septum does is it actually divides the heart in two, and most importantly, helps it equalize pressure so it can pump very forcefully, and it prevents the blood from mixing, so you don't get oxygenated and deoxygenated blood mixing back and forth, because that's very inefficient in terms of getting oxygenated blood to your body. Now, in some reptiles, like crocodiles, for example, they don't have a fully formed septum, okay? They're much more primitive than we are in terms of development, and their septum only goes part of the way up, and so they actually do get a little bit of mixing with oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, so definitely not as efficient as the mammalian heart. So in terms of like, where do we have oxygen versus no oxygen? On the right side of the heart, okay, we have no O2. There's my bad writing again. No O2. So the right side of the heart has deoxygenated blood. The left side of the heart has oxygenated blood. Okay, so that's one important thing to remember. Now, another thing to think about here is you can see that we also have these little valves here, okay, that kind of separate our atria and our ventricles. And you'll notice that that is, do we even have the names there for that? Oh, we don't. Those are our oh no, there they are. Those are our AV valves. So we have the tricuspid, and then on the left side of the heart, we have the mitral. The mitral, kiddos, is also known as the bicuspid, and that actually is the term in our program of studies. So tricuspid 3, right? So that means it's a 3-flap valve, and then the bicuspid 2, so it's a 2-flap valve, okay? And what those valves do is they actually help prevent backflow. So when the blood is moving from the atria down into the ventricles, those valves are going to close so that you don't get the blood going back up. Okay, we don't want backflow. So that is that's the basics of the heart, and we're going to take a look at different vessels now in terms of what's the difference between arteries, veins, and capillaries. So we're going to start with arteries, and arteries are defined as vessels that carry blood away from the heart. Okay, so the way I always remember it is arteries away from the heart. And we want to avoid that old kind of thinking that arteries always carry oxygenated blood and veins have deoxygenated blood, because there are exceptions to that rule, okay? So the true definition of an artery is that an artery always carries blood away from the heart to somewhere else, whether it's to the body or to the lungs, okay? So that's the first very important thing to remember. There are 3 arteries in terms of size, okay? So they're all arteries because of their composition, but and their structure, but they vary in size. So as we said on the previous slide, the largest of the arteries is the aorta. Remember, that's that big kind of horseshoe sort of shaped artery on top of the heart there. And then we narrow into arteries, and then we narrow into the tiniest of them all, called the arterioles. Okay, so aorta the largest, then arteries. So you can think of like the carotid artery, the femoral artery. Okay, so those are those big arteries that kind of branch off of the aorta. You have a dorsal aorta that goes down your back, and then we have arterioles, which are much smaller than the other 2 versions. Blood is pushed through the arteries with each beat of your heart and contraction of that left ventricle primarily. So looking at the properties of the arteries, this is very, very important. It's very prominent in the program of studies. So we want to make sure we understand the difference in terms of the structure or properties of the arteries, veins, and the capillaries. So the first thing to remember about the arteries is they have a relatively narrow lumen. And remember what we said lumen is, right? Lumen is the space inside a tubular structure. So when we were doing the digestive system, remember we had the lumen inside the small intestine. And so we have the lumen inside the arteries as well. So it's relatively small in comparison to veins, for example, and this helps maintain high blood pressure so that the blood can actually be moved throughout your body to deliver oxygen and nutrients. So that brings us to the next bullet. Arteries, especially that aorta, has a very thick muscular wall. And so if you look at this part here, okay, has a very, very thick muscular wall. And what that means is that the arteries are actually capable of constricting and contracting to help move blood along, okay, and keep blood moving throughout your body. They have collagen fibers that make up the kind of outer part. So arteries are quite stretchy and bendy and elasticy while still being super, super strong. Okay, and that of course allows them to expand, vasodilate, vasoconstrict without being damaged. Now, women in their childbearing years, estrogen, so that's from the time they start their menstrual cycle to the time that they enter menopause, where they don't have a period anymore, women, because they produce estrogen in the childbearing years, estrogen actually helps make the arteries super flexible and keeps them nice and bendy. And that's why it's very rare for women of childbearing age, unless there's some underlying health conditions or really strong family history. It's very rare for women in their childbearing years to actually have cardiovascular disease or have heart attacks. It's typically when women enter menopause and then their estrogen production declines, and then their arteries kind of harden and they aren't as bendy and flexible, so that makes them at much more risk for heart disease. Okay, but when individuals are young and healthy, their arteries are bendy, and that helps them withstand very, very high pressure. Now, in the previous slide, we said make sure that when you're talking about the arteries, you don't say, oh, arteries carry oxygenated blood, because most arteries can carry oxygenated blood, but there are exceptions, okay? So this is true for every artery except the pulmonary artery, okay? So the pulmonary artery actually carries deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart to the lungs to get more oxygen. And listen, kiddos, anytime you see that word pulmonary, okay, that always applies to the lungs. So keep that in mind. So if you think of like a pulmonary embolism, okay, that's like a clot in the lungs, okay? So pulmonary, think of lungs. So the pulmonary artery is going to take deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart and put it back to the lungs so it can pick up more oxygen and then return to that left side to be pumped out to the rest of the body. The aorta, remember, as we said, is the largest and the most elastic of the arteries. Coronary arteries we talked about, those are those beautiful little arteries on the outside of the heart, which help supply the heart tissue itself with oxygen and nutrients to keep functioning. When we do our heart dissection, before we actually start to get in there and dissect it and do split it apart and everything, you'll be able to see the coronary arteries on the surface of the heart, and they're actually quite amazing to look at. And so remember what we said, when you get a blockage in a coronary artery, so that the heart tissue that is supplied by that artery can't get oxygen and nutrients, that means that that can lead to a heart attack or even cardiac arrest. So if that happens, we get that blockage, the heart muscle actually will slowly die. And in fact, when someone is having a heart attack, that is what causes the pain, because heart muscle will keep beating continuously, but as it becomes deprived of oxygen and nutrients to keep cellular respiration going and keep making ATP, it eventually, those muscle cells will actually burst. And that's actually what causes the pain when someone is having a heart attack. What's the difference between a heart attack and cardiac arrest? A heart attack, the heart is still beating, okay, but it's in distress. Cardiac arrest, that's when someone's heart completely stops, and then hopefully they have a chance to have the defibrillator, right? So the paddles to get an electric shock to get the heart beating again, okay? So that's the difference between those two things. So the heart is very unlike other organs. It's not going to slow down. It's going to keep beating and beating and beating and beating until those cells are completely depleted of oxygen and nutrients, and they eventually burst and die. In terms of which arteries do you need to know, you kind of need to know the aorta for sure. You need to know the properties of the arteries. And then one of the ones that sometimes is mentioned is the carotid. So the carotid arteries actually take oxygenated blood from your aorta up into your head and into your neck, okay? So that's what's important. Arteries, because they carry a lot of blood and they're under very high pressure, that's why if someone gets in an accident and one of their arteries is severed, whether it's the carotid artery or whether it's like the femoral artery, which is in your groin, because your heart keeps beating no matter what, and it keeps pumping out that blood, if one of the arteries is nicked or severed, literally the blood is just pumped right out of the person's body, and it's a very, very serious situation, which can lead to death if there's not like immediate intervention in terms of emergency care. So moving on to our next vessels, we're going to talk about veins next. So veins have, again, they're blood vessels. They're still part of our cardiovascular system. We saw that big vena cava on the right side of the heart, taking deoxygenated blood back to the right side of the heart so it can go pick up more oxygen at the lungs. So in terms of their composition, veins are different than arteries in a number of ways. So first of all, just like the definition for arteries was that they take blood away from the heart, the definition of a vein is that they always take blood back to the heart. So again, avoid that oxygenated, deoxygenated piece because there's exceptions to that. So arteries take blood away from the heart, veins always take blood towards the heart. There are three versions of veins. So just like with the arteries, we had the aorta being the largest. Then we had arteries like the femoral, like the carotid, etc. And then we had the arterioles, okay, so going from largest to smallest. With veins, we have the same thing. So as you already know, our vena cava is our largest vein. And then, of course, we go into veins, and then we narrow down into the smallest version of veins, which are venules, okay? So vena cava being the largest, veins, like you can think of the jugular vein, which is in the neck. So you have the carotid artery in there, you have the jugular vein, and then we have venules, which is the most narrow of the three versions. So how do veins differ from arteries? First of all, instead of having a narrow lumen, remember when we looked at the arteries, the lumen was quite small. Veins actually have a very wide lumen in comparison. So take a look here, very wide lumen in comparison, and that is to support slow moving blood and allow movement of slower moving blood so it doesn't just stop and get clogged up in there, okay? The other thing you can notice from this little diagram is we don't have that thick muscular wall, right? Like we did with the arteries. So the muscular wall, or the wall that we have around the veins, is actually very thin, and it's not really capable of constricting and dilating like that the arteries are, okay? So that's a very significant difference too. The other important thing about the veins is that because the arteries themselves can constrict, right, and keep moving blood all over your body because they're capable of muscular contraction, veins actually have to rely on surrounding muscles. And when we say surrounding muscles, we mean our skeletal muscles to help push blood back up to the heart. So every time you're walking around and you're taking steps, your calf muscles are contracting, your quads are contracting, your hamstrings, your glute muscles, all those muscles are contracting to push blood back up from your feet, from your legs, back up to your heart. Okay, so that's why movement is very important in terms of circulation. So anybody that's ever gone on a really long plane ride or anything like that, you're always told, get up and walk around, don't sit because you're going to get blood clots and blah, blah, blah. And that actually is true. If you're sitting there for like 14 hours flying from here to Beijing or something, you actually can have pooling in the veins, which can lead to blood clots. Okay, not super common in young people, but you want to drink water to keep your blood thin, and you want to get up and walk around, or in the very least while you're sitting, flex your calf muscles, flex your butt muscles, because you want to keep those the blood moving back up to your heart. Okay, so skeletal muscles are very important. Another characteristic that veins have that arteries do not, and you can't see it in this graphic here, but we'll look at it a little bit later, is that they have valves. Okay, so arteries do not have valves. And if you think about what a valve is in any context, a valve always controls the flow of a fluid, right? So along the side of the lumen of the veins, I'm just going to switch colors here because we can't see that, we have valves. Okay, so they're like little flaps of tissue that actually help control blood flow. So arteries don't have that because arteries rely on the muscular contraction. So we have these valves to actually prevent backflow. And I want you to think about that for a minute. The blood in your toes has to get all the way back up to your heart to pick up more oxygen. And so, you know, yeah, the skeletal muscles help, but if you think about it, yeah, you know, you flex your calf muscles, that pushes the blood up. Well, what prevents it from just kind of going back down once your calf muscles relax, right? So that's the job of the valves. So you squeeze your calf muscles, the blood pushes up, the valves close so that the blood can't go back down, okay? Or else you would just be moving that blood up, moving it down, moving it up, moving it down, right? Doesn't make a lot of sense. So the valves are there to help prevent that backflow due to gravity. So just like we said, most arteries contain oxygenated blood. Most veins carry deoxygenated blood, okay? But just like we had the exception with the arteries, with the pulmonary artery, surprise, we have the pulmonary vein, okay? So the pulmonary artery takes deoxygenated blood away from the heart back to the lungs to pick up more oxygen. The pulmonary vein takes blood back from the lungs after it's picked up O2 and takes it to the left side of the heart so it can be pumped out again. So pulmonary again remembers lungs, right? So pulmonary artery, blood away from the heart because it's an artery, blood away from the heart to the lungs to get more oxygen. Pulmonary vein because it's a vein, blood back to the heart after it's picked up oxygen from the lungs. Okay, so that's our exception. So as we talked about, there's two vena cava, the superior and the inferior. So the inferior will take the blood from the lower body back up to the right atrium. And as we said, the superior vena cava is going to take blood from your head, your neck region, shoulders, etc., back to the superior vena cava. Take it back to that right side of the heart. So this graphic is actually a super common graphic, especially this bottom one here, in like test situations, because it's a very good graphic about what's going on between the arteries and the veins and the characteristics of the arteries and the veins. So obviously, if you saw this in a test situation, you wouldn't have the label. Okay, so what would you expect it to know? You would be expected to know that this one here is going to be the artery, and you should know that because it has a smaller lumen and it doesn't have any valves and it has that thick muscular wall. On the other hand, this side here, you should be able to identify as a vein because it has a larger lumen, a thinner muscular wall, and it has those valves, which are characteristic of veins only. Okay, so that's just kind of a common type of diagram because it asks kids to distinguish between characteristics between the two. The other thing it does is it shows you how you have an artery, which remember is, you know, a fairly large version, and then you kind of narrow into the arteriole, which is the smaller version. And on the other hand, we have a vein, which is the larger version, but then it narrows into the venule, which is a smaller version before it goes to our capillary bed. Okay, and we'll talk about the capillary bed a little bit later. And this graphic at the top here just kind of shows what we talked about with skeletal muscles. So veins have the valves, and so the arrows show you the direction of blood flow, right, from left to right of the diagram. But as the muscle contracts, so you can think of this even being your arm, okay, you have that antagonistic pair, so your bicep and your tricep work antagonistically to contract and keep blood moving. So as the muscles contract, they put pressure on the veins to keep the blood moving. And once the blood goes past the valve, then notice that the valve closes in order to prevent the blood from backflowing and going backwards. Now, if someone has varicose veins, and you've probably seen those before, maybe older people in your family or whatever, but it's when people get bulgy veins in their legs. Very unusual to get varicose veins, you know, in your arm or in your neck or something like that, because it's the legs where blood tends to pool and not be able to be pushed back up to your heart properly. So when a person has varicose veins, what really has happened is that the valves are not functioning properly, okay? So when the valves don't function properly and they don't close completely to prevent backflow, what ends up happening is some of the blood actually does get pushed back and just kind of accumulates in the vein and kind of stays there. And that pooling of blood eventually causes the vein itself to like stretch and get out of shape and bulgy. Okay, and that's really a diseased vein. So when someone has a varicose vein like that, the vein is not functioning properly. Now, usually people don't have a lot of health issues with varicose veins. People tend not to like them because they're like, oh, they don't look very nice. But in terms of health, they usually don't present a lot of problems. And sometimes kids are like, well, yeah, but what about the blood that's supposed to go through there? Well, listen, the veins that do most of the work in your body are actually deeply embedded in your muscle, kind of like these ones here in our picture. And so they really don't become varicose because the pressure from those skeletal muscles is too great. Okay, so it's usually the more superficial veins that are closer to the surface of the skin and not embedded in the muscle tissue. Those are the ones that tend to become more varicose, okay, not the ones that are on the not deep inside the muscles. Okay, so let's talk about our last type of vessels. And this brings us pretty close to the end of our lesson here. So capillaries are the smallest of the blood vessels, okay? So we have arteries, we have veins, and then we have capillaries, which are the teeniest and tiniest. And they are super, super thin, okay? That's one of their defining characteristics. They literally are one cell layer thick. So if you think about the outer part of the artery and the vein and how many cells there were there, especially in those arteries, the capillaries are literally only one cell layer thick on the outside. They are considered about the thickness of a human hair, so super, super, super tiny. These are the vessels that actually connect the arterioles and the venules, okay? So when you think of the smallest version of the arteries and the smallest version of the veins, the capillary bed is what connects them together in the middle and allows for materials exchange. So the main function of these vessels is to facilitate diffusion of nutrients and oxygen from the blood to the tissue, and then take waste products like CO2 and other waste products from the blood into the circulatory system to be dealt with. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why they have to be super, super thin, because if you are going to rely on quick diffusion of oxygen from your blood to your tissues so that cellular respiration can keep turning and ATP can be produced and you can actually, I don't know, survive, if you had a really thick capillary situation in terms of the wall, how would the gas diffuse quickly? Not going to happen. You'd like be dead before that happens. So part of the reason why capillaries are super, super thin-walled is so that diffusion of those gases and nutrients, etc., can happen very quickly and keep up that continuous supply to your tissues and keep taking the waste away. Okay, so what are some of the defining characteristics in terms of the structure of capillaries? They have a narrow lumen. I think that kind of goes without saying. If they're like as thick as a human hair, obviously they have a teeny tiny lumen. Now, how small is the lumen? So small that red blood cells literally have to travel through the capillaries single file, like marching single file. That's how small they are. That's how small the lumen is. The other reason that capillaries have to be super thin is because they literally have to fit around every single cell in your body. Every cell in your body needs oxygen, needs nutrients, and needs to get rid of waste products like CO2, right? So literally every single cell in your body has to have access to a capillary. So you got a lot of capillaries. It's estimated that 1 pound of fat tissue, for example, requires 7 kilometers of capillaries to sustain it in terms of nutrient and oxygen delivery. So think about that for a second. So a brick of butter, right, a pound of butter. So that's like a pound of fat. 7 kilometers of capillaries. That's a lot of capillaries. But it's because every single cell in your body needs access to a capillary in order to be able to get nutrients, get oxygen, and get rid of the waste products. So again, 1 cell layer thick to allow for easy diffusion, and they also have pores. Now, there's more than one type of capillary. There's actually 3 different types of capillaries, but they all have some version of pores. And if you think what pores are, think of like your skin when you sweat. Pores are little openings, right, that allow materials to move in and out. So capillaries have pores to allow materials like plasma to escape from body cells and to move in and out. So what is plasma? We'll learn about that a little bit more when we do blood and immunity, but plasma is the liquid part of blood. Okay, so blood is made up of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, all that kind of stuff, but the liquid part is the plasma. It's mostly water, but there's other stuff in there as well. But these little pores or little openings allow nutrients, etc., to move because they are dissolved in that plasma. So to look at our visual of our capillary structure, let's take a look at our graphic here. So like I said on the previous slide, the lumen is super, super thin. So here's that red blood cell that we talked about. One blood cell at a time basically can travel through the capillaries because they're super, super small. Now, if we look at the little pores here, you'll notice that these ones are called fenestrations. Now, fenestrations are like big pores. And so remember I said there's 3 different types of capillaries. We don't have to know the 3 different types. They're beyond scope for us. But some capillaries just have like little holes, little pores, okay? Other capillaries have larger pores, which are called fenestrations, just to allow for bigger molecules to pass through. And it all depends on where these capillaries are. So your digestive system has certain capillaries, your respiratory system has certain capillaries. It just depends where they are in terms of how big the little holes are that allow materials to pass through. So all you really have to remember is that pores are smaller. Fenestrations are just, they're a larger version of pores, but they both do the same thing. They allow materials to move in and out of the capillary from the surrounding tissues, okay? Because remember, we have a whole bunch of cells surrounding this capillary, right? So materials from the capillary, like the oxygen that red blood cell is carrying, has to be able to move out of the capillary to the cells. And the waste products, like the CO2 that the cells make through cellular respiration, that has to go into the capillary through those pores, through those fenestrations, so it can be dealt with as a waste product and, you know, if it's CO2, eventually exhaled.